Most people are afraid of coming home to an empty house. I came home early, and I wish to God the house had actually been empty. Welcome to Dad's True Life Revenge. Grab a snack, get comfortable, because this isn't the kind of story you can pause halfway through to make tea. And if you've ever had that feeling, that strange, hard to explain sense that something isn't right, not because you saw it, but because you felt it, like a scent in the air that doesn't belong there, then you know exactly what I mean. 23 years of marriage. 23 years of sharing a bed, a bank account, and a bathroom. Trust me, the bathroom is the real test of love. After that long, you develop something I can only describe as a sixth sense. You know when the other person is sad even when they're smiling. You know something's wrong before there's any proof. That afternoon I knew. From the moment I turned onto my street, I wasn't supposed to be there. My business trip to Denver ended a day early. Officially, the keynote speaker had a personal emergency. Unofficially, maybe he looked out at the audience and lost his faith in humanity. Either way, I caught the earliest flight home. No call. No text. I wanted it to be a surprise. Maybe I'd pick up Cassandra's favorite Thai food. Maybe for the first time in months we'd have dinner without a laptop sitting between us like a third person. I was in a good mood. That should have been my first warning. The first thing I noticed was the car. Preston's car. My son. 26, married with a perfectly decent apartment. One I helped furnish. So seeing his car parked in front of my house on a Tuesday afternoon wasn't strange. It was wrong. Completely wrong. I sat in my car for a few seconds staring at it, then said out loud, "Warren, why is your son's car here right now?" No answer. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where people are just relaxing. This was heavy silence. The kind that makes the air feel thicker than it should be. I opened the door and stepped inside. And in that moment, everything changed. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously. A lot of people watch but never do, and it costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next was the moment I realized I wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. Preston and Lindsay were sitting on the couch, together. And here's the part that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. They weren't watching TV, they weren't on their phones. They were just sitting there, like two people in a waiting room. The kind who've already accepted whatever news is coming. Preston looked up first, and I need you to pay very close attention to this detail. He wasn't surprised to see me. Think about that for a second. Your father is supposed to be in Denver. He's not due back for another day. And suddenly he walks through the front door, unannounced. And you don't react. No flinch, no question, no natural expression at all. Just a slow blink, and a look I can only describe as calculated. Lindsay smiled, and I'm telling you that smile had no business existing that afternoon. I set my bag down. I asked Pri, "What's going on? Where's your mother?" Preston cleared his throat. "Dad, we were just about to call you." I looked at him. "Really?" I didn't ask. I stated it. He gave a small nod. "Mom had an episode this morning," he said. "She's at Mercy General now. She's stable." I didn't hear anything after Mercy General. Everything else got cut off like someone muted the sound inside my head. I turned around. 11 seconds later I was in the car. I know that sounds like a strange number, but shocked as that. It makes you remember meaningless details, while the important things try to tear you apart from the inside. I called Kurt on the way. Curtis Barnes. My best friend since 1987. He's seen me through everything: marital problems, 2 recessions, and the disaster that was my attempt to grow a beard in 2009. If there's anyone in this world who will tell me the truth without sugarcoating it, it's Kurt. He picked up on the second ring. "Warren, what's going on?" "Cassandra's in the hospital," I said. "Mercy General." I just got home, and Preston and Lindsay were sitting in the living room like they already knew how the movie ends. Silence. On the other end. Then Kurt said, "What do you mean, knew how it ends?" "My son didn't react when I walked in," I said. "I'm supposed to be in Denver." Another pause. Then very quietly he said, "Warren, you need to stay calm." "I am calm," I said. "No," he replied. "You're driving. That's not the same thing." He wasn't wrong. Mercy General is 15 minutes from my house. I made it in 9. I will not be answering any questions about that. When I walked into the hospital, I knew one thing. That feeling I had standing at my front door. It didn't go away. It came with me. And now, it was bigger, heavier, sharper. It wasn't a hunch anymore. It was a warning. Dr. Beverly Nash met me at the nurses' station, a woman in her 50s, steady voice, unshaken eyes. I liked that. Right now, I needed stability more than anything. Mr. Trevor, she said, I'm glad you're here. Your wife was brought in this morning by your son. She paused just long enough for me to keep up. She's showing signs of severe disorientation. Her organs are under stress. And there are elevated levels of toxicity in her blood. Toxicity. I repeated the word like I could understand it better if I slowed it down. She nodded. We're running more tests, but I want to be direct with you. The pattern we're seeing doesn't match a sudden illness. Another pause. It suggests something. Cumulative. Cumulative. That word hit like a silent punch. I placed my hand on the counter, trying to keep my voice level. Doctor, are you telling me something has been introduced into my wife's system? She didn't answer right away. She looked straight at me. I'm saying we need answers. And I believe you do too. I walked into the room, and I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. I've seen Cassandra in a lot of states. Laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. Angry enough to make me rethink every decision I've ever made. Exhausted. Radiant. Broken. But I had never seen her like this. She looked drained. Like someone had found a switch inside her and slowly turned down everything that made her, her. Machines hummed in steady rhythm. An IV dripped quietly. And the woman who once chased a contractor out of our house with a wooden spoon for cutting corners was lying there. Small. I sat beside her, took her hand. It was colder than I expected. I leaned in and said softly, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until I know exactly what happened to you. I'm not a man who makes promises lightly. But when I do, I keep them. I stepped back outside. Preston and Lindsay were in the waiting area. Of course they were. Preston stood up. Dad, we need to talk. There are things you don't. I raised my hand. Just once. He stopped mid-sentence. There must have been something on my face in that moment. I don't know what it was. But it was enough. I said not now. Then I turned away. Walked to the corner of the waiting room. Sat down. Took out my phone. And did the one thing they never expected me to do. I started locking everything down. Every account. Every access point. Every single thing they could touch. One by one I shut it all off. And when the notifications started lighting up their phones, I looked at Lindsay first. That smile. That out-of-place smile. Gone. In a single second. And right then I knew. We weren't having a conversation anymore. We were in a war. And I had just kicked a hornet's nest. The only question left was how many hornets were inside. There's something you need to understand about denial. It isn't loud. It doesn't knock on your door and shout that something is wrong. It's more polite than that. It sits across from you, pours you a cup of coffee, and tells you everything is fine. That you're overthinking. That you're tired. That the people you love couldn't possibly do the things your instincts are screaming about. I lived with denial longer than I care to admit. But that night, sitting in the hospital parking lot at 9:43 p.m., with Cassandra somewhere above me hooked to machines, and Preston's expression replaying in my head, I got rid of it, permanently. Changed the locks. Threw away the key. I called Kurt. He picked up immediately. Talk to me, he said. She looks bad, Kurt, I said. And my voice betrayed me on that last word. The doctor mentioned toxicity. Said it's been building. Not sudden. I heard him exhale slowly. Then he said, Warren, building means intentional. I know, I said. And Preston and Lindsay were at the house. They're in the waiting room right now. Silence. Then Kurt said something I will never forget. You need to think very carefully about who's had access to Cassandra's food, drinks, and medication every day for the past few months. A pause. Who's been there? And then, it hit. Not a sound you hear, the kind you feel. 4 months ago, Cassandra twisted her ankle coming down the stairs. Nothing serious, but enough for Preston to step in, almost immediately. He suggested Lindsay come by every morning, help Cassandra with breakfast, her medication, keep an eye on things while I was at work. At the time, I thought it was care. I even told Kurt maybe I'd misjudged the kid. If I could go back to that moment, I'd do something very simple. I'd slap myself. I went back to the waiting room. Preston was standing near the vending machine, arms crossed, trying to look innocent, failing, spectacularly. Lindsay was sitting down, her phone face down on her lap. And you need to understand this, Lindsay never puts her phone down. I've seen her scroll during holiday prayers. So a phone placed face down. That's not a habit. That's strategy. I sat across from them. Preston spoke first. Dad, I know how this looks. I looked at him. Do you? Tell me how you think it looks. He shifted. Mom's had health issues for a while. We've just been helping. Lindsay comes every morning to make sure she eats and takes her vitamins. Vitamins? I repeated it. 3 supplements, he said. Which ones? I asked. He blinked. I said it again. Which ones? He looked at Lindsay. Lindsay looked down. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. But enough. Enough for me to not need another answer. I stood up. You two go home, I said. Dad, Preston started. I said his name once. Quiet. But enough. Go home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because at that point I didn't have doubts anymore. I knew. And once you know, everything changes. The only question left was how far they'd gone. I sat alone in the waiting room with a cup of hospital coffee, and calling it coffee was already being generous. The clock read 2:00 a.m., and I started doing what any reasonable man would do when he suspects his own son might be poisoning his wife. I started digging, layer by layer, detail by detail. I opened the banking app, the last 6 months. I'm not an accountant. I don't even like online banking, but even I could see it. Something wasn't right. Small withdrawals. $200, $250, $202. Numbers that don't draw attention. They don't shout. They whisper. But when you add them up, they tell a different story. $11,000 in 5 months. From our joint account, mine and Cassandra's, the account Preston had access to for emergencies. $11,000. I stared at that number for a long time. Then I called Kurt. He picked up like he'd been waiting. 11,000, I said. No greeting. No build-up. From which account, he asked. The joint one. Small withdrawals. Regular. Deliberate. Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Warren, this isn't impulsive. This is a plan. Someone sat down and figured out how to not get caught. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Then I said, my son. Those 2 words. I never thought I'd say them like that. In that context. Kurt spoke carefully. We're not completely certain yet. I said no. I know. Silence. Heavy. The kind you don't just hear, you feel it pressing against your ribs. Then Kurt said, Warren, I need you to prepare yourself. You think 11,000 is the problem, but I have a feeling. There's something much bigger behind it. And this is the part you need to remember. Kurt was about to find something that would make $11,000 look like pocket change. And it would change everything. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously, so many people watch but never do. It costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about realizing the person you trusted most might have been planning something you couldn't even bring yourself to imagine. I leaned back in the chair, stared up at the hospital ceiling. Cold white lights. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. And for the first time in hours, I wasn't wondering if I was right. I started wondering what I was still missing. The next morning, Kurt called me at 7:14. I remember the exact time, because I was staring at the clock, watching every minute crawl by waiting to be allowed in to see Cassandra. He didn't say hello. He went straight in. Warren, you need to prepare yourself. I didn't stand. I sat down, set my coffee aside. Go on. 6 weeks before Cassandra was admitted, she met with an attorney about her will. Alone. She didn't tell you. I closed my eyes. That part wasn't unusual. Cassandra liked surprises. She planned everything. Birthdays, anniversaries. Even dinner could feel like a military operation. But what Kurt said next that changed everything. She updated her insurance policy. The old one, Preston, was the secondary beneficiary. Standard. You set that up years ago. But Cassandra changed it. She removed Preston completely and transferred the full benefit to a charitable foundation. One she's been quietly building for the past 2 years. The policy value $2.3 million. I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything suddenly connected, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. Preston knew. I don't know how, but he knew. He knew his mother was about to erase his name from $2.3 million, and instead of calling her, instead of asking, instead of doing anything a normal person would do, he sat down with his wife and made a decision. Make sure Cassandra didn't live long enough to finalize the paperwork. 30 days. The attorney had a 30-day processing window, and Cassandra had exactly 30 days. I sat there, in the waiting room, not moving, not thinking, just letting the full weight of that truth settle on me. $11,000 was never the goal, just the opening move. If you've made it this far, and you think this story has already gone far enough, believe me, it goes further. If you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Thank you. I stood up, straightened my jacket, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to give them even a second to prepare. I was going to do the one thing they never thought I could do. I was going to be patient. I called my lawyer, Margaret Holloway, 30 years of experience, a voice that didn't need volume to command silence. I told her everything, the money, the vitamins, the insurance, the timeline. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Don't touch anything in the house. Don't talk to them. Don't post anything. Don't hint at anything." "Can you do that?" "I can," I said. "Good," she replied. "Because when this unfolds, it will unfold completely. No way out." I asked, "I want them to feel every part of it." She said, "Trust me. They will feel every square inch." For the first time in hours, I almost smiled. Almost. Because now this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was a plan. And me. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life. Not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening all at once. Cassandra started to stabilize. Dr. Nash said the treatment was working. Her kidney function was improving. And on the second day she opened her eyes, looked at me, and said in a weak voice that still somehow carried its edge, "Warren, you look terrible." I laughed. A real laugh. Right there in the ICU, the nurse looked at me, like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had lost a piece of it. But hearing Cassandra speak like that again, that familiar sharpness I'd lived with for 23 years, it was like someone flipped a switch back on inside my chest. I took her hand. "You're safe," I said. "Everything's being handled." She looked at me, longer than usual, then said very quietly, "It's Preston, isn't it?" Not a question. A conclusion. I didn't answer. I just tightened my grip on her hand. She closed her eyes again. "You know," she murmured, "I always thought he got the worst parts of me, and none of the good ones." Even like that, Cassandra still saw more clearly than anyone else. By the 4th day, Margaret called. Her tone hadn't changed, but the content had. "Warren, we have enough." Kurt had done his work. Security footage from a pharmacy 2 towns over. 3 purchases. Same supplement each time. Always paid in cash. Always alone. Except the 3rd time, Lindsay sat in the car, waiting. That supplement contained a compound. Taken over time in small doses, tasteless. It created exactly the toxicity pattern Dr. Nash had identified. Margaret continued, "We have bank statements. We have the money trail. We have access logs. And here's the part you'll appreciate." Preston called the attorney's office. Pretended to be Cassandra's assistant. Asked about the status of the policy change. He left a number. His own. I was silent. 10 seconds. Then I said, Kurt, did I raise a criminal mastermind? Or an idiot? Kurt replied. Both. And that's the problem. If you've made it this far, you already know where this is going. But trust me, how it happens is what you'll remember. Hit subscribe. Stay until the end. Because this is where things start getting paid for. Day 5, they came to the hospital. Together. Carrying flowers. Flowers. I looked at that bouquet and realized some people don't understand irony until it's standing right in front of them. Preston walked in, smiling. Dad, how's Mom doing? We've been so worried. I looked at him, then at Lindsay, then back again. She's awake, I said. She's talking, and she's going to make a full recovery. I saw it. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not relief, not happiness. Calculation. Quick, cold. Lindsay said, That's wonderful news. I nodded, then said the police are on their way. No raised voice, no drama. Just a sentence. Like I was commenting on the weather. The color drained from Preston's face so fast it was almost impressive. What Margaret filed everything this morning, I said. The footage. The bank records. The calls. The toxicology. All of it. Neatly packaged. Lindsay made a sound, not a word. Just the moment a person loses control. Preston started, Dad. Just listen. I cut him off. No. There isn't a sentence in this language that can explain what you did. So don't. I glanced at the flowers. Then said, Niece bouquet. Cassandra will love them. From someone else. They were arrested right there in the hospital parking lot. I stood by the window looking down. Everything unfolded exactly the way Margaret said it would. No shouting, no chaos. Just 2 uniformed officers walking up a few quiet words, and then the handcuffs. Preston tried to say something. He always believed words were his strongest weapon. This time they didn't work. Lindsay stayed silent. The calculated kind of silence. Like she was already one move ahead, thinking about deals, thinking about reduced sentences. Kurt was standing next to me. I didn't even notice when he arrived. He's always been like that. Shows up when it matters. He asked, How do you feel? I thought for a moment. Then I told the truth. Like I've aged 10 years in 5 days. Like I want to sleep for a month. Like I've lost something I'm never getting back. I paused. Then added, But also, like this is the first time in my life I'm completely certain about something. Kurt nodded. What about Cassandra? I turned back toward the hallway. Through the small window of her room I could see her. Small, but still there. Cassandra's going to be fine, I said. She always is. She's the strongest person I know. And she chose to marry me. That alone proves she can survive anything. Kurt laughed. A real laugh. Light, short, but enough to take some weight out of the air. 3 months later, Cassandra walked back into the house. A Saturday morning. Golden light spilling through the hallway. She stood there looking around like she was taking inventory of everything she almost lost. Then she turned to me and said, Warren, the kitchen needs repainting. I looked at her, then at the wall, then back at her. No chance, I said. I just painted it 2 years ago. She pointed. That's not white, she said. That's the color of an administrative apology. I looked again, then picked up my phone and called a painter. If you've come this far with me, you've seen everything. But there's one thing you should take with you. You can't control what people become in the dark. You can only control what you do when the lights come on. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join us. Hit like, subscribe. Because stories like this, they're not just about revenge. They're about truth. And what we do when we finally see it. The trial lasted 11 days. 11 days of hearing everything again. Every detail. Every piece of evidence. Every cold decision replayed in front of everyone. I sat there, next to Cassandra, her hand in mine steady firm as if what happened hadn't broken her. Margaret stood across the room, calm, precise. Not a single wasted word. She didn't need drama. The truth was heavy enough. Pharmacy footage. Bank records. Toxicology reports. the impersonated phone call. Each piece on its own just a fragment. But put together, it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was a map, a plan, clear, calculated, intentional. Preston sat there in a suit I once paid for, staring straight ahead. Not at me, not at Cassandra. Lindsay was different. She kept looking around, assessing, measuring, like she was still searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The jury stepped out. The room went quiet. A familiar kind of silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't frightening. It was just waiting. 4 hours later they came back. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. When things are that clear, you don't question the ending. The judge read the verdict. Guilty. Both of them. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. Financial fraud. The words landed not fast, not slow, just certain. I didn't look at Preston. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't need to. That moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about Cassandra. She squeezed my hand, tighter, like steel. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "I want Thai food." I turned to her. Now she opened her eyes, looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about Thai food for 3 months, Warren. Don't test me." I nodded. "All right." We stood up, walked out of the courtroom, left everything behind. If you've come this far, you've already seen what matters most. Not the verdict, not the crime, but what comes after. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like and subscribe, because the one thing I want you to remember isn't what they did, it's what we survived. And this story didn't end in the courtroom. It ended where it began. At home. I told you from the very beginning I came home early, and I wished that house had been empty. I was wrong. I'm glad I came home. I'm glad I walked through that door. And if you think that was just luck, it wasn't. That was the moment the light came on. And when the light comes on, you don't get to look away. You have to see. You have to face it. You have to decide what you're going to do next. 3 months later, we were sitting around a table. Cassandra, Kurt, Margaret, Dr. Nash. Everyone was laughing, talking. Cassandra was telling one long story, waving her hands around like she had never spent a day in intensive care. And I looked at her, not because I'd never looked before, but because this time I understood the value of being able to. There are things in life you assume will always be there until you almost lose them. Family, trust, safety. And when those things break, they don't always break loudly. Sometimes they break in silence, one piece at a time. That was the first lesson. Do not ignore small signs. The details you keep talking yourself into believing don't matter, because sometimes those small things are the very things trying to save you. The second lesson, don't let denial become your shelter. The truth does not disappear just because you refuse to look at it. It just waits. And when it comes back, it usually brings consequences with it. And the last lesson, you cannot control what other people become in the dark, but you can control how you respond when the light comes on. You can choose action, choose truth, choose to protect what matters. If you are in a situation where your instincts are telling you something is wrong, don't stay silent. Don't wait. Look closer. Ask more questions. And if necessary, act sooner. Because I came home just one day early. One day. And that day saved my wife's life. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, thank you, truly. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join our community. Hit like, subscribe, because here we don't just tell stories. We talk about what happens inside families in the dark, and in the moments when everything changes, and maybe the next story will be the one you need to hear at exactly the right time. At my wife's funeral, before the warmth had even left her body, my own son pulled me aside and whispered coldly, "From now on, we're cutting off support. You'll have to take care of yourself." His wife didn't even bother to look up from her phone. I said nothing. 7 days later, my screen showed 69 missed calls. The heat of California's Central Valley in May is unbearable. It hangs heavy in the air, carrying the smell of dry dust and fading almond blossoms. I stood in front of Linda's grave. My formal CAL FIRE firefighter uniform suddenly felt too tight around my chest. I didn't cry. 30 years of fighting wildfires taught me one thing. Tears don't put out pain. They only blur your vision when you need clarity the most. Eric stood beside me. He was the only son I had ever been proud of. But he wasn't looking at his mother's coffin. He was looking at his watch. He pulled me aside as if I were a debt that needed to be settled. After he delivered those cold words, I glanced over at Christine, his wife. She stood 3 steps away, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes never left the social media notifications lighting up her screen. In that moment, the fake sobbing around us meant nothing. A deep silence settled over me. I didn't answer him. I would deal with everything calmly, carefully, so my son could learn the true strength of the old man he thought he had abandoned. My name is Ray Wallace. I'm 69 years old, a retired firefighter, now a carpenter. I spent my entire life saving strangers' homes from burning down. Now I have to figure out how to save my own life from the ungrateful people who share my blood. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this story travels. Betrayal never comes from enemies. It always starts at the dinner table. It begins with promises that were never meant to be kept. Eric was always talking about how hard the logistics industry had become. He talked about pressure at work whenever he needed to borrow money from me. But he forgot one simple fact. I was the one who paid $19,300 to fix his roof last year. I was the one paying the insurance for the car he's driving. Those 69 missed calls on my phone weren't concern. They were debt collectors. Legal demands from people Eric had secretly contacted. My son thought he was abandoning a weak old man. What he didn't understand was the real strength of a firefighter. As I watched the first shovelful of dirt fall onto Linda's coffin, I made a decision. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't argue. I would do what I do best. I would build a boundary. A firebreak so strong that no child, no matter whose blood runs in their veins, could ever cross it. I sat in my woodworking shop. The smell of pine resin hung thick in the air. The lathe hummed softly, spinning idle in the background. I looked at my phone screen. The number was clear. 69 missed calls. All of them came within the 7 days since Linda passed away. Not a single call asking if I had eaten. Not one message asking if I had managed to sleep. Only bank notifications, insurance confirmations, and unfamiliar numbers from law offices handling property disputes. Eric didn't call me. He was busy calculating how much his mother's ashes were worth in dollars. Last year he told me he needed $14,500 to invest. He said it was the only opportunity he would ever get. I signed the check without hesitation. He never mentioned the money again. He lives upstairs in this house. The rent slowly dropped from $800 to $0. I stayed silent. I thought it was support. He thought it was his right. If I ever sat down and added up all the money I had spent on my son, the number would be terrifying. But it would still never matter more than the years I spent raising him and teaching him how to become a decent man. The change in a person is like the way a house foundation slowly sinks. It happens quietly. So slowly, you don't notice it until the doors stop closing properly. When I looked at Eric at the funeral, I saw a door that had completely warped. He was no longer my son. He was a stranger taking inventory of my life. I began to act immediately. I started digging through old files and documents. In one folder I found a printed browsing history from the shared computer in the living room. Eric had searched for trust dispute lawyers 2 months earlier. At that time, Linda was still fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. He had prepared for his mother's death like it was a business transaction. Anger surged through my chest, hotter than any wildfire I had ever faced. I took a deep breath. The dusty air filled with wood particles tightened in my lungs. Then I looked at the number again. $19,300 for the roof repair I had just paid for last month. Eric had told the contractor that he was the homeowner. He had deliberately put his name on the repair invoices. A careful move, designed to create the illusion of control. I turned off the lathe. Silence returned. I was no longer the weak old father they expected. I am Ray Wallace, and I know how to put out a fire from the inside. I began gathering the original documents. The house deed from 1991, transfer receipts. Every piece of proof. For now, I wouldn't say a single word to them. Silence is the strongest weapon a firefighter has before the water hits the flames. I looked out the window. The Central Valley was growing dark. The almond fields disappeared slowly into shadow. Eric and Christine were upstairs, laughing. They thought they had already won. What they didn't know was that I had just started building the first firebreak. This battle wouldn't be fought with shouting. It would be fought with precise numbers and legal evidence that no one could deny. Dinner tonight felt like torture. I sat at the head of the table. Eric and Christine sat across from me. They were eating the steak I had bought. Using the silverware set Linda had carefully preserved for 30 years. No one looked me in the eye. The sound of knives and forks scraping against porcelain plates rang dry and hollow. It sounded like a chisel striking rotten wood. Eric started talking about renovating his mother's room. He called it optimizing the space. He talked about repainting the walls. He talked about replacing the hardwood floor. He never once asked if I wanted to keep any memories. In his eyes, I was nothing more than an obstacle that needed to be moved. His change wasn't sudden. It had been a slow erosion. This family relationship was collapsing, like the way a house foundation slowly sinks, quietly, almost invisibly. You don't notice it right away, but one day you realize the bedroom door won't close properly anymore. Cracks begin running along the walls. That's when you know the structure is no longer safe to live in. I looked down at my hands. The scars from my years as a firefighter and the calluses from carpentry stood out clearly under the light. I built all of this. I paid $14,500 for Eric's mistake 2 years ago. I stayed silent when he ignored the debt. I thought patience would wake him up. But in carpentry, if you use rotten wood for a support beam, the entire roof will collapse on your head. Christine's cunning was even more frightening. She always measured a room before stepping into it. She knew how to use sweet words to hide her greed. She mentioned how old I was getting. She talked about how inconvenient it must be for me to climb the stairs. They were clearing a path to push me into some nursing home out in the suburbs. A current ran down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was the clarity a firefighter feels when he realizes the flames have reached the gas tank. I didn't argue. I simply took a sip of water. Cold. Clean. It helped keep my face as hard as stone. Their exploitation had reached its limit. Eric lived in my house while the rent dropped slowly, until it became zero. He used my money to fund his comfortable life. He thought I was an old tree that had run out of sap. He thought he could cut me down and split me into firewood. He was wrong. Old trees have the hardest core. I began watching them the way I watched the wind during wildfire season. I wrote everything down. Switched invoices. Whispered conversations in the kitchen. The times Eric signed my name on service documents without permission. That night I returned to the workshop. I picked up my caliper. I began measuring everything carefully. Not the wood. My patience. The foundation of this house was completely ruined. It was time for a full reconstruction. I wasn't going to repair it anymore. I was going to tear it down and build again from the ground up. Alone. I walked into the living room at 2 in the morning. The silence inside the house on Thesa Street felt artificial. I went to Eric's desk. I wasn't a thief. I was the owner inspecting my own property. I turned on the shared computer. The smell of warm electronics mixed with the scent of wood dust still clinging to my jacket. I opened the browser history. The entries appeared like deep cuts across a fine piece of timber. 2 months before Linda took her last breath, Eric had searched for trust dispute lawyers. He had been looking for ways to invalidate my inheritance rights. He had prepared for his mother's death like an investment project. My heart slowed. 52 beats per minute. That's the calm of a firefighter who sees flames crawling up onto the roof. I didn't feel heartbreak anymore, only disgust. When a piece of wood rots from the inside, you cannot save it. You cut it away to keep the rot from spreading. I gathered the original documents. I took the house deed from the wall safe. My eyes rested on the number 1991. The year we bought this house. Linda had been a co-trust manager, but I was the sole legal owner. Eric and Christine had always believed they held legal power here. They thought I was a confused old man who didn't know how to keep his paperwork. They were wrong. The next morning I drove to the Tower District. I found a small apartment on the second floor of an old building. The smell of fresh paint and the quiet atmosphere immediately put me at ease. I signed the lease right away. This was my first firebreak. I would retreat before the flames of greed burned everything down. When I returned home, Eric and Christine were getting ready to go to a wine party. They were dressed elegantly. They had used my money to buy those expensive outfits. Christine looked at me with a trace of pity. She said I should rest more. I nodded without speaking. The silence of a firefighter studying the direction of the wind. When their car finally pulled out of the driveway, I began moving. I didn't take many belongings, only what truly mattered. My carbon steel chisels, my small wood lathe, and most importantly, the legal documents. I loaded them neatly into the back of my pickup truck, each item wrapped carefully in cloth the way evidence is protected at a fire scene. I stood in the living room one last time. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed steadily through the house. This place held 34 years of memories, but now it felt like a structure burning from the inside. I closed the door. I didn't lock it. I wanted them to feel the emptiness when they walked back in. I drove away under the golden sunset of the valley. The Central Valley in May always feels suffocating, but this time my lungs felt wide open. I had left the danger zone. Now it was time for the ones who stayed behind to face the truth. Eric believed he had pushed me into a corner. What he didn't understand was this: a good carpenter always has a backup plan. You never begin construction without a detailed blueprint. My blueprint was already finished, and the most interesting part of this game was just beginning. I would show them what happens when a structure stands without a foundation. Attorney Diego Romero's office sat on a quiet street corner where few people passed by. The smell of old paperwork and the cold air from the air conditioner filled the room. Diego looked at me over a pair of steel-framed glasses. He didn't talk much. That's exactly why I chose him. Professionals rarely waste words. I placed the original house deed from 1991 on his desk. The paper had yellowed with age, but the numbers were still perfectly clear. Diego flipped through each page carefully. He paused at the ownership section. Linda had been listed as a co-trust manager, but I was the sole legal owner. Eric and Christine had always believed they held half the power. Their entire plan had been built on a false assumption. In carpentry, a measurement that's off by 1/10 of an inch can ruin an entire oak table. In the legal world, one small line of text can destroy an entire greedy scheme. Eric made his mistake at the very first measurement. I told Diego I wanted to completely restructure the trust. Not revise it, erase it, and rebuild it. I removed Eric and his family from the inheritance list. I crossed out their names the same way I would cut away a piece of rotten wood with a saw blade. Betrayal must be answered with the precision of the law. I wasn't angry. Anger makes your hands shake when you're guiding a saw. I needed a steady hand to sign these documents. Diego asked if I was certain. I looked at my calloused hands. These were the hands that raised Eric. The same hands that built the house he was trying to take from me. When termites eat their way to the core of a tree, the only way to save the garden is to burn that tree down. I nodded. My signature cut across the paper, clean and decisive. I stepped out of the office. The Fresno sunlight reflected off the windshield of my pickup truck. I felt a strange sense of relief. Eric was still in that house. He was probably dreaming about selling it and investing the money into another logistics venture. He didn't realize that the ground beneath his feet had already disappeared. He was standing on an illusion created by his own greed. Handling a family crisis is like turning a block of hardwood on a lathe. If you rush, the wood will snap and fly back into your face. I hadn't rushed. I had waited. I had watched. And now I had my shield. A legal fire break had been built. Eric's fire might burn bright, but it would never reach me again. I drove toward the Tower District. My new apartment was small, but it was clean. It didn't carry the smell of lies. I began planning the next step. I needed Terry Bennett, a private investigator with real experience. I wanted to know exactly what Eric had done with the roof repair invoices. I wanted to know what he had told the real estate brokerage offices. Firefighting taught me one thing: you never leave a single ember behind. All it takes is one glowing spark for the fire to rise again. I would extinguish every last hope they had, slowly, with silence. and numbers. Eric believed he had won because I walked away. What he didn't understand was this. Sometimes you step back only to deliver a more precise strike into the eye of the storm. This fight was no longer about money. It was about justice. It was about teaching ungrateful children a lesson they would never forget. A house is not just bricks and wood. It is respect. And they lost that respect the moment they whispered those cold words at their mother's funeral. Terry Bennett sat across from me, in a nearly empty diner. He placed a thick file on the polished wooden table. The smell of burnt coffee, mixed with the scent of asphalt drifting through the half-open window. Terry didn't waste time. He slid several photographs toward me. They showed Eric walking in and out of real estate offices. My son had already listed the house on Thesa Street for sale. He was using a forged power of attorney to claim he had the right to handle the transaction. He was trying to move my property before I even realized what he was doing. In carpentry, that's the kind of termite damage that eats deep into the grain of the wood. You don't see it from the outside, until the entire structure collapses. My chest tightened, not from grief, from disgust at how calculated the plan was. Eric had planned every step. He thought I was an old firefighter past his prime. He thought I only knew how to use strength, not strategy. He was wrong. When you face a wildfire, you don't just watch the flames. You study the wind. You study the dryness of the soil. The next day, Christine asked to meet me at a cafe in the Tower District. She wore a modest floral dress. Her voice carried that warm, artificial tone people use when they are pretending to care. She talked about the idea of family and home. She said Eric was very worried about my health. Then she told me they just needed me to sign a few documents so it would be easier to manage the family property. I looked straight into her eyes. I asked only one question. What's the difference between my house and the place you two are living in? Christine froze. The smile on her lips stiffened like peeling paint. She started mumbling something about convenience and the future of their children. I stayed silent. My silence sat between us like a block of ironwood. Then I stood up and left the money for the coffee. I already had everything I needed. Terry had collected statements from the real estate brokers Eric had contacted. They had deliberately hidden the fact that I was still alive and still the legal owner of the property. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was fraud. I drove straight to the main brokerage office in the city. I placed the original deed on the manager's desk. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized they had nearly been involved in an illegal property sale. I shut down every attempt Eric had made. I built a strong legal barrier around the house on Thesa Street. Firefighting teaches you that prevention is stronger than reaction. I stopped the fire while it was still just embers in Eric's mind. A strange calm settled over me. I didn't need to shout. Truth carries its own weight. An old oak tree doesn't need to prove its strength to the wind. It just stands. I returned to my temporary apartment. I began sharpening my chisels. Steel scraping across the whetstone made a sharp, cold sound. Each stroke strengthened my resolve. I would not let them take one single square foot of that house. I would show them something they had forgotten. A father's patience has limits. And when that limit is broken, the consequences can be more devastating than any wildfire they have ever seen. Night settled over the Central Valley, bringing cold winds with it. I sat by the window, looking in the direction of the old house. Eric and Christine were probably there right now, dreaming about the money they would make from selling it. They had no idea. I had already pulled the foundation out from beneath their feet. Tomorrow the truth would hit them like a flash flood, and they would have nowhere left to hide. I stood in the darkness of my new apartment in the Tower District. I watched the screen of my phone. Terry Bennett had just sent me a video from a hidden security camera. In front of the house on Thesa Street, a white moving truck was parked. Eric and Christine were carrying boxes outside. Those weren't their clothes. They were Linda's furniture. Greed had cost them their judgment. When they realized they couldn't sell the house, they decided to sell everything inside it instead. They were selling my memories for dirty cash. I picked up the phone. I dialed Eric's number. He answered after 3 rings. His voice sounded rushed. I took a deep breath. My voice stayed calm. No shouting. Eric, I said, I can see the white truck. You have 30 days to pack what belongs to you and leave the house. After that, the police will carry out an eviction order. Silence filled the line. A silence that smelled of guilt. Then Eric exploded into shouting about his rights and how unfair everything was. I didn't stop them from taking those items at that moment. Sometimes greed needs to finish its own work. They would pay for taking things that never belonged to them. I hung up. I didn't feel heartbreak anymore. That feeling died with Linda. I looked into the mirror. Ray Wallace, 69 years old. I spent my whole life saving things that belonged to other people. Now I was delivering justice for myself. It didn't feel good. It felt like cutting off a gangrenous arm to save the rest of the body. Painful, but necessary. I returned to my desk. I reviewed the legal documents one last time. Diego Romero had completed every step. The eviction order had been signed. Every attempt Eric and Christine made to move my property had been documented. They had dug their own grave with their own scheming. At night, the Central Valley carries a strange silence. I knew tomorrow would be a long day. The police would come. The truth would unfold in front of the neighbors. I would have to face the empty marks on the walls where the television once hung, but the structure of the house would still stand. Just like me. A house that took 34 years to build doesn't get sold in a single weekend, and a lifetime spent building honor cannot be destroyed by two ungrateful people. I closed my eyes. I could hear the wind moving through the almond fields. The wind was changing direction, and this time, it was blowing toward me. A strange sense of relief settled over me. This war was almost over. Justice is not revenge. Justice is balance. I lost Linda. I also lost a son who let greed blind him. But I found something else. I found myself again. A calm man standing in the eye of the storm. A firefighter who had finally brought the last fire under control. The next morning I returned to Thesa Street. The white truck was gone. Only tire tracks remained pressed into the dry yellowed grass. I unlocked the door with the original key. The house felt brutally empty. Eric and his wife were probably somewhere enjoying the little money they had made selling my belongings. There was no laughter, no smell of Linda's cooking, only dust and betrayal hanging in the air. Eric had done exactly what I expected. He had removed the 65-inch television I installed myself. He took the oak dining set I spent 6 months polishing by hand. On the walls, only gray scars remained where family photographs once hung. They took everything with material value. But they didn't understand something important. The real value of this house lived in the beams and foundation they could never reach. In truth, sooner or later, the entire estate would have been theirs anyway. All they had to do was behave with a little respect. I stood in the middle of the living room. The silence pressed down like weight. I took a deep breath. The air inside the house felt thick and stale. I opened the windows and let the Central Valley wind move through the rooms. Then I looked again at the file Terry had sent me. Eric had sold his mother's memorial dining table for 1/10 of its real value. He had been desperate for fast cash. And desperation is the biggest mistake a man can make. I picked up my phone and called Diego Romero. I told him to immediately file a property damage claim. Not a few $100s. Thousands. Antique furniture. Family heirlooms. Irreplaceable pieces. Eric would pay for every scratch on these wooden floors. If this story has brought you this far, please take a second to do something small that means a lot to us. Subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, and it costs you nothing, but it helps us more than you might imagine. The anger inside me had changed. It had become a cold, focused energy. I walked into my old bedroom. The bed frame had been dismantled, but in the corner of the room I noticed a small piece of wood left behind. A scrap from my workshop. I closed my hand around it. The rough grain against my palm helped keep my mind clear. Then I started photographing every corner of the room. Evidence. Proof of property destruction before the eviction order had fully taken effect. Eric thought he was clever for taking everything. He didn't realize that every object he carried away was another piece of evidence against him in court. He was writing his own sentence. I sat down on the empty floor. The heat of May began creeping into the house. But I didn't feel lonely anymore. Instead, I felt a strange calm. I had finally removed the rotten parts from my life. The house was clean now, free of greedy hands. I would rebuild it, or I would sell it, and begin an entirely new journey. Handling a family crisis is like turning a block of hardwood on a lathe. You have to know when to stop and inspect the surface. I've already done that. The surface is scratched and damaged, but the core of the wood is still intact. My name is Ray Wallace, and I have never failed to protect what belongs to me. Tomorrow justice will be carried out under the authority of the law. This fire ends here. The day of the eviction was a dry, unforgiving morning. I stood on the curb across from the house on Thesa Street. 2 county deputies stood beside me. Eric stepped out the front door with a face red from anger. Christine followed behind him. She no longer looked elegant. Her hair hung loose and messy. Her eyes burned with hatred. Eric started shouting in the middle of the neighborhood. He called me a cold old man. He said I had betrayed my own blood. I stood still like a slab of stone. I looked at him the way a firefighter watches a dying pile of embers. There was nothing left to argue about. His fire had no fuel left. All that remained was black smoke and meaningless insults. One of the deputies handed Eric the final documents. It was a compensation demand of $8,800 for the furniture they had sold off. Eric stared at the number. Then he looked at me. His hands began to shake. He finally understood that every escape route had been sealed. His cunning had collided with the legal wall I had spent a month building. I didn't feel victory. I only felt completion, like hammering the final nail into a coffin that holds your worst memories. I watched them load the last bags into their car. There was no goodbye, no apology, only the silence of people defeated by their own greed. When their car disappeared beyond the almond trees, I walked back into the house. Now the house was truly mine again. Empty. Still, I walked into the room where Eric used to live. The smell of cigarettes and disorder still lingered in the air. I opened the windows wide. I let the Central Valley wind sweep away the last traces of their ingratitude. Then I picked up a broom. I began sweeping the debris they had left behind. Each stroke of the broom felt like a release. Justice had been carried out. Poetic justice. Not through violence, but through calm resolve and precise numbers written on paper. Eric and Christine would now live in rented apartments. They would have to pay for their lives with their own labor, the work they had spent so long trying to avoid. I walked down to the woodworking shop in the basement. I turned on the lights. A soft yellow glow spread across the saws and the stacks of oak waiting nearby. This was where I truly belonged. There is no betrayal here. Only the honest grain of wood. I placed my hand on the surface of the lathe table. It still held a little warmth from the last time I worked. 69 years old is not the end. It is the moment when you finally have enough experience to tell the difference between good wood and rotten wood. I have removed the rotten parts from my life. Now it is time to create something new. I looked into the mirror once more. My eyes had returned to calm. The fire had been completely extinguished. The fire break had done its job. My name is Ray Wallace, and I took my house back. Both the house made of brick and wood, and the house inside my soul. Everything began again from zero, but at least it was a clean zero. 3 weeks after the eviction order was carried out, the house on Thesa Street was completely cleared. Every trace of Eric and Christine had disappeared. I received an envelope from Diego Romero's office. Inside was a check for $8,800. It was the compensation the court forced them to pay for the furniture they had sold off. I looked at the check. I didn't feel richer. I only felt balance. I donated the entire amount to the CAL FIRE Charity Fund. This money belongs to firefighters who were injured in the line of duty. It belongs to people who run into fire to save others, not to people willing to burn their own home down for ambition. I decided to sell the house. 34 years is a long time, but a house that took 34 years to build should not be sold in a single weekend. I chose a young family as the buyers. They looked at the house with hopeful eyes, just like Linda and I did in 1991. I handed them the original key with a peaceful heart. It was a considerable amount of money. Money that should have been my son's inheritance, if he had only known how to behave with dignity. But that was no longer possible. I moved to a smaller house near the foothills. The workshop there was larger. My brother Harry lived nearby. Every afternoon we sat beside the wood lathe. The motor hummed steadily. The smell of pine wood and sawdust filled the air. The Central Valley is still brutally hot in the summer, but the shade here feels gentle. Justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs precision. I carried out justice for Linda. And I taught Eric a lesson about the foundation of honesty. Harry looked at me and asked if I regretted anything. I adjusted the chisel. Steel touched wood and created a surface as smooth as silk. I had no regrets. Handling a family crisis is like turning a block of hardwood on a lathe. If you rush, the wood will fly back and hit you in the face. I was patient, and now I have peace. I looked out the window. The almond fields stretched to the horizon. My life now is simpler, calmer, stronger. Betrayal has faded away like smoke after a wildfire. My name is Ray Wallace. I spent my whole life putting out fires, and this final fire helped me find myself among the ashes. Everything in life has its price. The price of freedom is loneliness at the beginning, but the price of tolerating evil is the collapse of your entire soul. I chose correctly. I turned off the lathe. Silence filled the workshop. But it wasn't the dead silence of Thesis Street. It was the silence of a finished masterpiece. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about the story in the comments. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching. Dad, we've made our decision. We're selling the house at Kerr Lake. You have until the end of the month to move out. Every single word hit my ears. Clear, cruel. I felt my chest tighten like a steel beam collapsing under too much pressure. This house was not just wood and walls. It was my blood, my sweat, my entire life. It carried the soul of Renee, my late wife. And now the son I sacrificed everything to raise was ordering me out like I was some old piece of furniture. It was a windy May morning at Kerr Lake. I was sitting by the dock watching the waves roll softly against the wooden posts. My phone vibrated on the table. Brad, my oldest son. 8:14 in the morning. I answered the call. Before I could even say hello, his cold, arrogant voice cut through the line. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not care what I was doing. He went straight to business like a man clearing out unwanted inventory. I stayed silent. My hand tightened around the armrest of the chair. Rage climbed into my throat like fire. I am a structural engineer. I spent my entire life calculating pressure, stress points, and structural failure, but I failed to calculate the breaking point in my own son's character. Brad kept talking in that superior tone. He said the real estate market was hot. He said I was too old to live alone in such a large house. He said he had already found a buyer. He had even signed a brokerage agreement without asking for my permission. Not once. He treated me like a confused old man who would simply obey. Betrayal always tastes bitter. But betrayal from your own blood tastes like destruction. He wanted to sell this house for a few $100,000 to fund the lifestyle of his new wife. They thought I had outlived my usefulness. They thought I was powerless. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Settle in because this story is going to take you a long way. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Brad ended the call with a fake little reminder as if he were doing me a favor. I placed the phone down on the table and stared across the lake. Suddenly the anger disappeared. In its place came something far more dangerous. Calm. A cold smile slowly spread across my face. A house can only stand if the foundation is strong. Brad and Tim wanted to tear mine apart. What they did not know was this: an engineer always keeps a backup blueprint. After the long beep from Brad's call finally faded away, the world around me became strangely silent. I sat motionless in the old armchair. My eyes drifted down to the cedar floorboards beneath my feet. Time had faded their color, but they were still solid and unshaken. I am a structural engineer. My entire life has revolved around blueprints, concrete, and load-bearing structures. I understand the value of a strong foundation better than most people, and this house at Kerr Lake was the greatest structure I ever built. I started building it in the spring of 1993. Back then, Renee and I had only been married a few years. We did not have much money, but we had enormous dreams. I still remember the feeling of pouring the first concrete foundation with my own hands. Every brick carried my sweat and my wife's smile. Renee stood right there on the porch corner, holding a glass of lemonade, her eyes glowing with excitement as our dream slowly rose from the ground. Together, we picked every wooden panel and every screw. I designed this house to survive the harshest Wisconsin winters. For more than 30 years, its structure had never trembled before a single storm. This was the house where Brad and Tim took their first steps. This was the house that held their childhood laughter. And this was the house that carried the final warmth of Renee before illness took her away from me. Every corner of this place carried her spirit. To me, this house was part of my soul. It was legacy. It was love. It was the final promise connecting me to my late wife. But to my sons, it was nothing more than property converted into cash. Brad and Tim looked at these walls and saw numbers. They either forgot or chose to forget that this very house had raised them into men. Selling it was like taking a hammer and smashing apart the memory of their own mother piece by piece. The pain inside me slowly turned into heartbreak. I lifted my eyes toward the family photo hanging in the living room. Renee was smiling in the picture, holding our two young boys in her arms. How had those innocent little boys become this cold and greedy? The warmth of memory vanished beneath the weight of reality. My sons had changed. Somewhere along the way, the rust of greed had begun eating through this family, and I had been too blind to see it. But Brad and Tim underestimated their engineer father. They thought I would cry, beg, or quietly pack my belongings and leave in humiliation. They believed they controlled the entire game after deciding the fate of my property without permission. What they failed to understand was this greed makes people blind, and blind people always miss the most important structural flaw. This battle had only just begun, and I had already found the fatal crack in their cruel little plan. The betrayal born from greed does not arrive like an explosion. It spreads like rust, quietly eating away at the load-bearing structure of a house. Slowly, patiently, corroding everything from the inside out. And by the time you finally notice it, the entire structure has already collapsed. As I sat there, I realized with bitter clarity that my family had been destroyed by that same silent corrosion. The one behind it all was Brad. My oldest son used to be a good kid. But everything changed after he married his new wife. She had an endless appetite for luxury. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, flashy parties meant to impress strangers who did not care about them. Brad's salary could never keep up with the bottomless greed she carried inside her. Financial pressure slowly transformed him into an arrogant and selfish man. He stopped seeing my home as family. He started seeing it as a lifeboat for his dying bank account. And then there was Tim, my younger son. He was not the mastermind, but he was something worse in his own way. A coward. Tim had always been afraid of his older brother. He had no backbone, no conviction of his own. Deep down, he knew forcing their father out of his home was wrong. He knew selling the house behind my back was unforgivable. But he nodded anyway. His weakness disgusted me almost more than Brad's cruelty. I spent my entire life teaching my sons about honor, gratitude, and responsibility. And in the end, what did I get in return? Two grown men circling their own father like vultures, waiting to strip away the last roof over his head. For the first time, I began to feel uneasy. Not for myself, for what they might do next. Because greed never stops once it awakens. They had already hired a realtor without permission. They had already given me a deadline to leave my own home, which meant they had likely prepared something far more calculated behind the scenes. I looked out the window toward Kerr Lake. The sky had darkened. A real storm was coming. But my sons had made one critical mistake. In construction, even the smallest crack in a blueprint can bring down an entire skyscraper. Brad and Tim were amateurs trying to outplay a veteran engineer. They thought I was old, weak, confused. They believed I knew nothing about the schemes unfolding behind my back. What they did not realize was this. Overconfidence is the deadliest structural flaw of all. And that flaw was about to lead them straight into a trap they would never see coming. The next phone call on Sunday would expose every ugly truth hiding beneath their smiling faces. Just as I predicted, the next call came on Sunday. That day, rain poured endlessly from the sky. Heavy drops slammed against the windows as if they were trying to shatter the last traces of peace left inside the house. Then my phone rang. This time, it was a group call from both Brad and Tim. I turned on speakerphone. Brad's voice came first, carrying the same impatient, arrogant tone as always. But this time, I could also hear Tim's weak, guilty muttering in the background. Brad wasted no time. He announced that they had officially signed a contract with a real estate agent named Mark Benson. According to him, the house at Kerr Lake had been appraised at $390,000, a pathetic number, an insult to a solidly built home sitting on prime lakefront property. But my sons were desperate for money. They were willing to sell their mother's memories and throw their father out onto the street as long as cash arrived quickly enough. I asked them only one question, my voice perfectly calm. "You signed a contract without asking me first." Brad laughed softly through the phone. He said it did not matter. He said Mark Benson was a professional and had already found a buyer willing to pay within the month. That was when Tim finally spoke. He told me I should cooperate. He said moving into a small apartment downtown would be better for someone my age. They worked together surprisingly well. One pushed, the other pretended to comfort. Together, they were trying to corner me. Anyone listening to this would feel furious. My own sons were making decisions about the life of the man who had spent decades feeding them, protecting them, and building their future with his bare hands. Inside me, the pressure reached its breaking point. The pride of a father was being trampled. The dignity of an engineer was being mocked. They truly believed I was nothing more than a harmless obstacle standing in their way. Then Brad crossed the final line. In a cold voice, he said that if I refused to move out willingly, they would hire people to pack my belongings for me. The cruelty of those words went beyond anything I had imagined possible. I took a deep breath to hold back the rage boiling inside my chest. I did not yell. I did not cry. And suddenly the silence on my end made them hesitate. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought the old man was finally broken. Brad ended the call after reminding me about the signing appointment scheduled for the following week. Then the line went dead. I sat alone in the darkness of the room while the rain continued crashing outside. They thought they had won. They thought they had trapped me with nowhere left to run. But they were wrong. The battle had only begun. The moment the call ended, I stood up and walked toward my office. It was finally time to open the locked security drawer, because hidden inside that drawer was a weapon powerful enough to destroy their entire plan. I walked into my office in complete silence. Outside, the rain continued hammering against the windows, but inside me, the storm had settled. I was no longer angry. A good engineer never lets emotion take control when a structure is on the verge of collapse. I stepped toward the old oak desk. Beneath the right corner was a drawer that always remained locked. I called it the serious drawer. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key. The sharp click of the lock echoed through the empty room. Then I opened the drawer and removed a thick blue folder. It had been sitting there untouched since 2016. Inside were the documents for my second property, a place called Garrison Lake Lodge. The lodge sat deep inside an isolated pine forest somewhere in Wisconsin. No one in my family knew it existed. Not Brad, not Tim, no one. Back in 2016, after completing a massive construction project, I used my personal savings to quietly purchase the land. Over the years, I secretly transformed it into one of the most luxurious private retreats in the region. I had planned to reveal it as a surprise inheritance for my sons after my death. It was the only legal inheritance they had left. A strange mixture of curiosity and disappointment rose inside me as I flipped through the pages. Photographs of the lodge appeared one after another. The massive stone fireplace, the handcrafted cedar interior, the private lake hidden behind walls of towering pine trees. Its value had skyrocketed over the years. Meanwhile, my sons were desperately clawing over the $390,000 from selling the old Kerr Lake house. They had no idea that their blind greed was about to cost them something worth many times more. I slowly ran my hand across the folder. Their betrayal had finally helped me make a clear decision. My backup blueprint was ready, and now it was time to activate it. I carefully placed the documents into a black leather briefcase. They wanted to play a cruel game with me. Fine. I would play along. I would stay silent and let them keep performing their little victory dance all the way to the closing table. Tomorrow I would meet with my lawyer, and together we would prepare the perfect trap. The next morning I drove downtown to the office of attorney Raymond Castillo. The rain had stopped, but puddles still covered the streets, reflecting the dull gray sky above. A strange mixture of anticipation and tension kept my mind razor sharp. On the passenger seat beside me rested the black leather briefcase containing the Garrison Lake Lodge documents and the legal paperwork for the Kerr Lake house. By then, my home at Kerr Lake had officially been listed online for $390,000. When I saw the listing price, I almost laughed. My sons were fools. They believed they were walking away with a fortune. They had no idea they were throwing away a treasure for pennies just to satisfy temporary greed. And somehow, that insult only strengthened my resolve. I entered Raymond's office a few minutes later. Raymond Castillo had been my lawyer and close friend for years. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a look filled with concern. He had already reviewed the documents I sent him earlier. I sat down calmly and explained my plan. I told him I would not resist. I did not want shouting matches or ugly confrontations with Brad and Tim. Instead, I wanted him to prepare every legal document necessary for the sale. But everything had to happen exactly according to my script. Raymond stared at me in disbelief. He asked if I was truly willing to let my sons go this far. I looked him directly in the eyes and answered in a cold, steady voice. Let them finish their performance. A good engineer never puts out a fire the moment it starts. I'm going to let the fire of their greed grow as large as possible right there at the closing table, and at the exact moment they believe victory is finally theirs, I'll remove the one support beam holding everything together. That was the beginning of my silent game. For the entire following week, I completely cut off contact with both of my sons. I ignored every call, every message, every voicemail. My silence convinced Brad and Tim that I had finally broken down and accepted my fate. A few days later, they sent me the details for the closing appointment at the Lakeland office. Their message was short and cold. Bring your identification. Be there on time. I read the text message slowly and smiled to myself. The blueprint was complete. Every piece was now in position. My silence had become the most dangerous weapon of all. Brad and Tim were confidently marching toward the Lakeland office, without realizing that the room waiting for them was no longer a closing office. It was a legal execution chamber built specifically for them, and in the next chapter, the shock waiting inside that room would shatter everything they thought they controlled. On the morning of the closing, I arrived at the Lakeland office 15 minutes early. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and polished leather. Tension pressed against my chest like concrete settling under massive weight. I sat silently in the corner of the room, one hand gripping the black leather briefcase beside me. Exactly at 9 o'clock, Brad walked in. Confidence radiated from every step he took. He wore an expensive tailored jacket and polished leather shoes that gleamed beneath the office lights. His face carried the bright excitement of a man convinced he was about to strike gold. He glanced at me with fake sympathy before casually taking the seat across from me. Brad kept scrolling through his phone, smirking to himself. I knew exactly what he was doing, counting money that did not belong to him yet. A few moments later, Tim entered the room. Unlike his brother, he avoided looking at me altogether. His head stayed lowered, guilt written all over his face. Then the buyers arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh entered alongside the realtor Mark Benson. They carried thick folders filled with paperwork. The closing table was finally complete. Benson quickly spread the contracts across the table and pushed them toward Brad with eager hands. Brad grabbed the pen immediately. Without hesitation, he scribbled his signature across the seller's section, as though the house already belonged to him. Then he turned toward me with that same arrogant tone. Dad, your turn. Sign it so we can finish this quickly. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. The contrast between us could not have been clearer. Brad sat there, polished, impatient, intoxicated by greed. Meanwhile, I remained perfectly still, cold, solid, like reinforced concrete. I stared silently at the papers in front of me. This was the moment my son's cruelty reached its peak. They truly believed I would sign away my own home and quietly accept exile from the house I built with my bare hands. Slowly, I placed the leather briefcase on the table. The silence in the room suddenly changed. Brad's smile stiffened. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the table. What are you waiting for, Dad? People are waiting. I still said nothing. I simply looked directly into his eyes. It was the cold stare of an engineer who had finally located the fatal fracture inside a collapsing structure. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, but not for a pen. If you've made it this far into the story, then it probably stirred something inside you. Help us out with one quick thing. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you're still here. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. I pulled out my phone. The screen displayed an incoming call from attorney Raymond Castillo. Without breaking eye contact with Brad, I placed the phone directly in the center of the closing table and turned on speakerphone. Then Raymond's firm voice filled the room. And in a single moment the entire atmosphere changed. Attorney Raymond Castillo's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp and unwavering. "Good morning, everyone at the Lakeland office. This is Attorney Raymond Castillo, legal representative for Mr. Jude Logan. I have an urgent announcement. The sale of the Kerr Lake property must stop immediately. This contract has absolutely no legal validity." The room fell into dead silence. Brad's arrogant smile vanished instantly. He shot up from his chair, his face burning red with rage. "What are you talking about?" he shouted into the phone. "I'm his son. My brother and I have full authority over this property." Across the table, realtor Mark Benson suddenly began sweating as he frantically flipped through the paperwork. But Raymond's voice remained calm, cold, precise, like a blade sliding through steel. "You are mistaken, Brad. You and Tim are listed as heirs under your late mother's estate. However, you failed to read the attached conditions carefully. According to Renee Logan's will, the Kerr Lake house remains under the sole ownership authority of Mr. Jude Logan until the day of his death. Any sale, transfer, or financial agreement requires his direct written consent and signature. Your attempt to sign documents and hire a realtor without your father's authorization is a direct legal violation. This transaction is now officially frozen." And just like that, the truth detonated in the middle of the room. The engineer's strike had landed perfectly. A deep sense of satisfaction rose inside my chest as I watched my son's entire scheme collapse beneath them. Justice had finally arrived. A good engineer always leaves behind a backup design. Brad and Tim thought they could outsmart a man who spent his entire life calculating structural weaknesses and failure points. They were wrong, completely wrong. The buyers, Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, immediately stood from the table in outrage. They felt deceived and manipulated. Within seconds, they gathered their paperwork and announced they were canceling the deal entirely. Before leaving, they threatened legal action against Mark Benson's brokerage company. Benson looked like all the blood had drained from his body. He turned toward Brad with pure hatred burning in his eyes. And then came the collapse. Brad dropped back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The polished confidence from earlier was gone. Now there was only panic. Pure panic. He looked up at me with trembling eyes. "Dad, why would you do this to us? We really need this money." Beside him, Tim had started crying, quietly begging for forgiveness under his breath. I slowly stood from my chair and buttoned my jacket calmly. Then I looked at my sons. But I no longer saw my children. I saw two greedy men completely blinded by their own hunger. I looked directly at Brad and spoke only once. "You were willing to sell your mother's memory for $390,000. Greed has made both of you blind." Then, I picked up the black leather briefcase from the table. The battle at the Lakeland office was over, and my sons had suffered a humiliating defeat. But I was not finished yet. That was only the first strike, only the first crack destroying the illusion they had built around themselves. Because I still had one final blow waiting for them. One number so massive, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I did not rush to leave the Lakeland office. Instead, I stood there quietly, looking down at my two broken sons sitting across the table. Panic and despair had swallowed them whole. But for me, the performance was not over yet. Not even close. They still needed to learn the final lesson about the true value of what they had betrayed. Slowly, I placed the black leather briefcase back onto the table. The sharp click of the lock opening echoed through the room once again, drawing Brad's trembling eyes toward me. For a brief second, hope flickered across his face. He thought I was about to change my mind. He thought mercy was coming. But he was wrong. I pulled out the thick blue folder containing the documents for Garrison Lake Lodge. The folder from my serious drawer. Then I tossed it directly in front of him. "Look at this." My voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of concrete collapsing onto steel. Brad's hands shook as he opened the file page by page. His eyes widened the moment he saw photographs of the luxury lodge hidden deep inside the Wisconsin pine forest. Then his breathing stopped completely when he reached the final valuation page. $1.1 million. Slowly, I began to speak. Every sentence cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "This is Garrison Lake Lodge. It is worth nearly 3 times more than the Kerr Lake house you were so desperate to sell. I secretly bought and built it back in 2016. My original plan was to leave it to both of you as your inheritance after I was gone. It was supposed to belong to my sons." The room felt like it had just been hit by an explosion. Brad and Tim froze completely. The contrast between the miserable $390,000 they had been fighting over and the $1.1 million they had just lost forever was too much for them to process. Brad's face turned pale as death. His lips trembled uncontrollably. Beside him, Tim broke down, sobbing, pounding his forehead against the table in unbearable regret. For a quick profit, they had destroyed the very foundation of their own future. Then I delivered the final blow, the knockout strike. I looked directly into their shattered faces and spoke one final truth. But that was yesterday's plan. The moment you called me on Sunday, I met with attorney Raymond Castillo. I signed every document transferring full ownership of Garrison Lake Lodge to a non-profit organization that supports underprivileged children. You will not receive a single dollar from my estate. The silence afterward was unbearable. Then I gave them the final sentence they would carry for the rest of their lives. Your greed erased you from the blueprint of my future. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door without hesitation. Behind me came the sound of choking sobs and the complete collapse of two men who had just lost everything. But even then, the worst consequence for Brad had not arrived yet, and the true peace waiting for the old engineer still lay ahead. In the days following that disastrous closing meeting, my sons' lives spiraled into a collapse they could no longer stop. Brad soon found himself drowning in serious legal trouble. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh officially filed a lawsuit against him for fraud and the illegal attempt to sell property that was never his to control. And the woman he sacrificed everything for, the wife who loved luxury designer labels and expensive appearances, she wasted no time. The moment she realized Brad was buried in debt, she filed for divorce and walked away with what little money he had left. Tim suffered differently. He drowned in guilt. Day after day, he sent messages begging for forgiveness. Long apologies, broken promises, desperate pleas. But it was too late. Once the foundation of trust collapses, it can never truly be rebuilt. As for me, I moved into Garrison Lake Lodge. The peace there felt almost unreal. That evening, I sat on the wooden porch of the lodge, hidden deep within the Wisconsin pine forest. A glass of red wine rested in my hand while the sunset slowly melted across the still surface of the lake. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Beside me sat a framed photograph of Renee. I smiled softly at her picture and realized something important. I had protected the honor of this family. My story became proof of one simple truth about life. Greed is like defective material in construction. It may help you build beautiful illusions for a little while, but eventually it will bring the entire structure crashing down. Respect. Family. The love between parent and child. Those things can never be purchased with money. And the price of greed and betrayal will always be far greater than anyone imagines. If you fail to value the foundation of your family one day, you will pay for it with your future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what lesson you took away from it. I'll see you again in the next story. I lifted my glass and took one final sip of wine while the cool lake breeze drifted through the pine trees around me. The old engineer had finally completed the last blueprint of his life. A blueprint with no room left for betrayal, only peace, only justice. I was 63 years old, living alone, and I believed my son was the only person I could trust. But last week I lied to him about being alone. That lie uncovered a horrifying crime planned against me. I was lucky to survive long enough to tell you this story. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Please subscribe and comment number 1 so we can begin this story. Before we start, I want to remind you of one thing. This is a true story. If you stay until the end, you will understand why I say that. It started every Sunday morning at exactly 7 o'clock. The phone on the wooden table would vibrate right on time. The default ringtone echoed through the empty house. My son, a successful businessman, always called with perfect precision. He asked about the weather. He asked about the hydrangeas blooming outside the house. And always the final question was about the pills. Dad, did you take the white pill yet? Did anyone come by to visit you today? I used to think it was the purest form of devotion from a caring son. I felt proud of how attentive he was. I took the pills exactly the way he instructed me to, without the slightest doubt. This house was too large for an old widower. His voice over the phone was the only thread connecting me to the outside world. But that concern slowly began to carry a different taste. It no longer sounded like love. It sounded like surveillance. Like a prison guard checking whether his inmate was still locked inside the cell. The 7 o'clock phone call became an invisible pressure, crushing down on me. I stared at the cup of coffee, growing cold on the table. The steam had vanished. The silence inside the house began squeezing my chest tighter every day. I glanced toward the plastic pill organizer divided neatly by days of the week. The pills sat there in silence, waiting for me. Or perhaps waiting for the end of me. Love and harm can wear the exact same clothes for a very long time before you finally see through the fabric. That Sunday morning, something small happened that changed everything. Frank, my best friend from college, showed up unexpectedly at my door. He carried a paper bag filled with pastries, and the same bright smile I remembered from 40 years ago. It had been 18 months since this house last heard another person's laughter besides mine. We sat together in the living room talking about old memories, old road trips, old mistakes, old dreams that now sounded like stories from another lifetime. The clock slowly crept towards 7 o'clock. My heart suddenly skipped a beat. Then the familiar ringtone shattered the warm silence of the room. Out of habit, I answered immediately. My son's calm voice came through the speaker. He asked about my health, like always. Asked whether my knees still hurt from the cold weather. Asked whether the hydrangeas outside were blooming again. Then suddenly he asked the question, "Dad, is anyone there with you today?" I looked at Frank. He smiled casually and motioned for me to keep talking. But in that exact moment, an icy sensation crawled down my spine. The instinct of a man who had lived through more than 6 decades whispered something terrifying into my ear. Hide the truth. I took a slow breath. Then I answered quietly, "No, I'm alone today." It was the first time in 18 months that I had lied to my son. A harmless little lie. Or so I thought. Because the reaction on the other end of the call froze the blood in my veins. There was no immediate response, only silence. A long silence. Not peaceful silence, heavy silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. I could hear his faint breathing through the phone. He was thinking, processing the information. And then it came. A strange relief entered his voice, a disturbing softness, like tension had suddenly drained out of his body. "Oh, that's good then. Make sure you get some rest, Dad." That single pause before he answered changed everything inside me forever. His relief was not the relief of a loving son knowing his father was safe. It was the relief of a predator realizing the prey was finally alone inside the trap. My hand was still trembling after I ended the call. Frank looked at me with concern and asked whether I was all right. I forced out a weak smile to calm him down. But deep inside me something had cracked wide open. I turned toward the window. Outside, the hydrangeas drooped under the pale morning sunlight. Why was my son relieved to know I was alone? What exactly was he hiding from me? The answer was waiting inside the pillbox the very next morning. And Frank was the one who accidentally saw it first. Monday morning, Frank woke up early and insisted on making breakfast for both of us himself. I sat quietly at the dining table, watching my old friend moving slowly around the kitchen. The smell of freshly ground coffee spread through the house, bringing a false sense of peace into the room. Frank opened the medicine cabinet to grab my weekly pill organizer. By routine, the Saturday compartment should have been completely empty. I had taken those pills 2 days earlier. But suddenly Frank froze. He walked toward me, holding the plastic container in his hand, his forehead wrinkled with confusion. "John, what's this little white pill? Why did you leave it in here?" I looked down at the transparent compartment. A small, round white pill rested silently at the bottom. My chest tightened instantly. My mind began spinning. I had always been extremely careful about my health. I never forgot my medication, especially my blood pressure prescription. Never. I picked up the pill slowly. Its surface was smooth. No letters, no markings. Then realization hit me like ice water. It looked nothing like the capsules my doctor prescribed. Not even close. None of my medications were white. A horrifying suspicion began crawling through my mind. Who put this pill inside my box? This house was locked down tightly. The smart security system only allowed 2 people access to the front door code. Me and my son. He was the only person who entered my house every Friday afternoon to clean the place and prepare my pills for the following week. The equation was painfully simple, and the answer was so devastating it nearly stopped my breathing. My son had switched my medication, but how long had he been doing it, and why? I slipped the pill quietly into my shirt pocket, forcing myself to stay calm so Frank would not panic. But beneath the table my hand had already curled into a tight fist. I stared at the coffee slowly growing cold beside me. The truth was opening in front of me like a bottomless black hole. That pill was not medication. It was evidence. Evidence of a slow and calculated murder. My only son, the person I loved more than my own life, had been poisoning me in silence. And suddenly the terrifying dizziness from the past few months came rushing back into my memory. The nights where my vision blurred, the moments where my legs collapsed beneath me, the terrifying feeling that my heart might simply stop beating before sunrise. Back then I thought old age was finally catching up with me. Now I realized something far worse. Someone had been helping death reach me faster. The white pill rested deep inside my pocket like a piece of frozen ice, and with it came memories I had desperately tried to ignore. For the past 3 months my body had been screaming for help. The dizzy spells came almost every afternoon. Without warning, the floor would tilt beneath my feet. My thoughts drifted constantly inside a thick fog. I lost focus, lost direction, lost pieces of myself little by little. I told myself it was old age. I believed my mind was simply beginning to fade. But the most terrifying part was remembering the moments when my son witnessed those collapses. He would see me stumbling beside the couch, gripping the furniture just to stay standing, his face always filled with panic and concern. "Dad, did you forget your medication again?" His voice sounded so caring. He rushed over to support my weight, guided me gently back to bed, poured me a glass of warm water with his own hands. At the time, I felt deeply moved by his devotion. Now, replaying those memories made my skin crawl, because I finally understood the truth. He saw everything. He watched my body grow weaker day after day from the pills he himself had secretly replaced, and he kept doing it anyway. Some nights I woke up gasping because the room felt unbearably suffocating. The smart climate system inside the house constantly changed temperatures at strange hours. Whenever I questioned it, my son always smiled softly. "I adjusted it for your health, Dad. The weather has been dangerous lately." That kindness now revealed its true face. It was not care. It was control. He wanted me weak. He wanted me exhausted. He wanted me to believe I could no longer take care of myself. I sat alone in the darkness of the living room, staring through the window at the hydrangeas outside slowly wilting from lack of water. I no longer had the strength to care for them. Exactly the future my beloved son seemed to be creating for me. But one mysterious pill was not enough. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to witness what he was doing with my own eyes. That night I made the most dangerous decision of my life. I secretly installed a tiny hidden camera inside the bathroom, directly above the medicine cabinet. Then I connected the feed to my old laptop and waited patiently for Friday to arrive. I had no idea what I was about to discover. But the footage recorded that night completely shattered the heart of a father forever. Friday afternoon arrived exactly as expected. My son walked through the front door carrying a bag of fresh fruit in one hand. He smiled casually, talked normally, acted exactly the way he always did. He cleaned the living room for a while before walking into the bathroom to prepare my medication for the following week. I sat silently in the bedroom nearby, my fingers tightly locked together. The laptop resting on my knees displayed the live feed from the hidden camera. Every instinct inside me whispered the same terrifying truth. This was the moment everything would be exposed. On the small screen, I watched him standing in front of the medicine cabinet. He had no idea a hidden lens was staring at him from the darkness. He opened my weekly pill organizer. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bottle with no label. My heart stopped. He poured several small white pills into his palm. The same hands I once held while teaching him how to walk were now carefully removing my yellow prescription capsules one by one and replacing them with the white pills. His movements were calm, precise, practiced. He never trembled. Every motion looked disturbingly familiar, like someone repeating a routine they had performed many times before. Occasionally he paused to listen for sounds coming from my bedroom. When he was certain I was not approaching, he continued, The face of my beloved son stared back at me through the screen, but I no longer recognized him. That was not the caring child I raised. That was a cold-blooded predator wearing the face of an angel. Pain crushed my chest so violently I could barely breathe. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop myself from sobbing out loud. Hot tears rolled down my face and splashed onto the laptop keyboard. That was my son, the little boy I once carried in my arms, the child I spent my entire life protecting. And now he was personally guiding his own father toward death. If you've made it this far into the story, then you already know this nightmare is only getting darker. Please take one quick second to like, subscribe, and comment number 2 so I know you're still here with me. Most people watch without doing it, but it truly helps our channel more than you realize. And trust me, what happens next is something you will never see coming. The moment he stepped out of the bathroom, I slammed the laptop shut. I had to use every ounce of strength left inside me to keep my voice steady when he said goodbye before leaving. Then the front door closed. The sound echoed through the house like a coffin lid being sealed shut. I slowly collapsed onto the floor. Alone. Broken. The truth was finally undeniable, but the pain was almost too much to survive. I could not stay silent anymore. If I did nothing, I would die. The next morning I took one of the white pills and went directly to my doctor and the police. What they discovered inside my blood test results was not just poison. It revealed a horrifying secret about my son's real motive. I walked into the police station with a coldness that frightened even me. The weak old man I had been no longer existed after the moment I closed that laptop the night before. On the detective's desk, I placed the small plastic bag containing the white pills alongside the footage from the hidden camera. 2 days later, the blood test results arrived from the central hospital. The older doctor looked at me with deep pity in his eyes. Then he slowly shook his head. He pointed toward the numbers on the medical report. My potassium levels had been pushed down to a dangerously critical point. The white pills were powerful diuretics. For an elderly man with a heart condition like mine, taking them continuously for several months would almost certainly trigger either a stroke or sudden heart failure. A perfect natural death. Clean. Silent. No obvious criminal evidence left behind. I stared at the report in silence while my hands slowly turned numb. My own son had not tried to kill me in anger. He had planned it patiently. Scientifically. The financial investigation that followed exposed the rest of the nightmare. My son was drowning in debt. His cryptocurrency investments had collapsed. His real estate projects were frozen. The amount he owed was staggering. He needed money. Fast. A lot of money. Police investigators later found internet searches on his computer about the details of my life insurance policy. A $2 million policy I had signed 10 years earlier. With only one beneficiary. Him. That was the moment I understood the horrifying truth. My life had been reduced to a financial solution. Nothing more. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before walking back into my house that evening. Through the front window, I could see the cup of coffee still sitting untouched on the table. Cold. Lifeless. Everything around me suddenly felt disgusting. The police proposed a plan to catch him the following Friday inside my own home. I had to pretend I knew nothing. I had to sit across from my son one final time and act like a helpless father who still trusted him completely. But how do you hug the person trying to murder you? How do you look into your child's eyes and still say the words, "I love you"? The answer waited inside the suffocating confrontation that was about to destroy what remained of our family. Forever. The final Friday finally arrived. 2 plainclothes police officers were already hidden inside the back room of my house. I sat quietly in my armchair, forcing my breathing to remain steady. Then I heard the soft click of the front door unlocking. My son walked inside. The same warm smile rested on his face. The same gentle eyes. The same voice that used to make me feel safe. He walked over to me, placed a bag of groceries on the table, then leaned down beside my chair. His face overflowed with carefully crafted concern. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" Still getting dizzy, I looked directly into the eyes of the child I had spent my entire life raising. My chest tightened so hard it almost crushed the air out of me. But somehow I forced myself to smile. I told him I still felt weak, but seeing him always made me feel better. He nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then he stood up and walked toward the bathroom to perform the same ritual he had repeated every Friday for months. I watched his back disappear down the hallway. Every movement he made was now streaming live to the officers waiting in the next room. A few minutes later, he returned to the living room. In his hands were a glass of warm water and my prepared medication tray. He sat beside me carefully and held the water toward my trembling hands. "Your face looks worse lately, Dad. I think you need a stronger dose of supplements. Go ahead and take them. You'll feel better soon." Every instinct inside my body screamed at me to throw the pills across the room. But I had to finish the performance. I reached for the glass. My fingers brushed against his hand. Ice cold. Then suddenly, before the police revealed themselves, my son leaned forward and wrapped his arms tightly around me. He pressed his mouth close to my ear and whispered softly, "I love you so much, Dad. I want you to stay with me for a very long time." My heart shattered completely, because I knew that beneath those loving words lived a calculated murder plan driven by greed and desperation. And yet in that unbearable moment I still lifted my hand and gently patted his back. I whispered back, "I love you too." And the worst part was that I truly meant it. That was the real tragedy. Not the poison, not the betrayal, but the fact that even after discovering everything, a father's love inside me had refused to die. Then the illusion exploded apart. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The officers burst into the living room and pinned my son to the ground instantly. The glass shattered. The pills scattered across the floor. My son screamed in shock as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. But then something happened that froze every person in that room. Because instead of denying the crime, he started laughing. A cold, empty laugh. And the horrifying truth that came out of his mouth next left both me and the police completely speechless. When the handcuffs locked around his wrists, my son did not panic. He did not cry. He did not beg for forgiveness. He simply stood there staring at the two officers with a hollow expression so empty it felt inhuman. Then slowly he turned toward me. A pale smile appeared on his face. And in an eerily calm voice he said, "See, Dad, I told you the world out there is dangerous. I'm the only one who can truly protect you." The room went completely silent. Even the officers froze for a moment. Those words felt far more terrifying than the poison itself. Over the following days, the investigation uncovered something far darker than financial desperation. Police did not only find the mountain of debt, they also discovered hidden psychiatric records my son had kept secret for years. After extensive evaluations, the medical specialists reached a conclusion that left me completely shattered. My son suffered from severe paranoid anxiety disorder. The crushing pressure of financial collapse had slowly broken his mind apart. He became obsessed with control, especially control over me. Yes, the life insurance money was part of the motive, but the most horrifying truth was this. In his twisted mind, he genuinely believed he was protecting me. He believed the outside world was filled with people waiting to harm our family. And according to the broken logic inside his head, the only way to keep me safe forever was to make me weak, dependent, unable to leave him. If I could no longer walk properly, if my memory faded, if I depended entirely on him for survival, then I would always remain under his control. Safe. That was the word he used repeatedly during questioning. Safe. It was not ordinary greed. It was love distorted into something sick and unrecognizable. My son wanted to become the sole savior of my life, even if it meant slowly killing me in the process. That truth hurt far more than simple betrayal ever could. I sat inside the observation room, staring through the one-way glass at my only child. He was murmuring softly to himself. His fingers moved unconsciously through the air, repeating the motion of sorting pills into imaginary compartments. At that moment, I no longer knew what justice even meant. What punishment fits a man who is both a calculated criminal and a deeply broken patient? Prison, a psychiatric institution, mercy, condemnation. The answer would come in a way neither my son nor I could have ever imagined. Instead of a loud courtroom trial and a long prison sentence, justice arrived in a very different form. Based on the psychiatric evaluations and forensic reports, the court ruled that my son would be committed to a mandatory psychiatric treatment facility. Not prison, a place with endless white walls and barred windows. A place where he would finally be forced to face the paranoid monster slowly consuming his mind. The day they transferred him away, I stood at a distance watching the ambulance disappear beyond the line of trees. I did not cry anymore. The pain had burned itself so deeply into me that it transformed into something colder, something empty. I returned home alone, The same house that once felt like an invisible prison suddenly seemed enormous and strangely quiet. The very first thing I did was change every security code connected to the smart home system. Then I picked up the remote control myself and adjusted the living room temperature to 26 degrees. The temperature I personally loved, not the suffocating setting my son used to force on me while pretending it was for my own health. I walked into the bathroom and gathered every unidentified pill bottle I could find. Then I dumped them straight into the trash. The sound of the white pills rattling into the plastic bag echoed through the room like chains finally breaking apart. For the first time in months, my life belonged to me again. I decided when to eat, when to sleep, and most importantly, I controlled my own yellow blood pressure medication with my own hands. I was no longer a week-old prey waiting for judgment from the son I once adored. And strangely enough, I realized something important. My revenge was never about violence. It was never about hatred. The greatest revenge was surviving. Waking up, taking my life back and continuing to live well despite everything that had happened. I lowered myself into the familiar armchair and made myself a fresh cup of hot coffee. Steam rose slowly into the air, carrying a rich smell through the house. For the first time in a very long while, the silence no longer felt suffocating. I looked out the window toward the hydrangeas outside. After days of neglect, they seemed to be slowly recovering beneath the warm sunlight. I truly believed the nightmare was finally over, that justice had won. But the following morning, when I stepped outside into the yard, I noticed something small hidden beneath the hydrangea bushes. And in that instant, I realized the nightmare was not finished yet. Beneath the hydrangea bushes my late wife once cared for so lovingly, I discovered an old spare key buried deep beneath the soft soil. It was the same key I believed had been lost years ago. That was when I realized something even more chilling. My son had been preparing this plan for a very long time. Long before the smart security system was ever installed. This betrayal was not a sudden moment of madness. It was a trap carefully built over years. I slowly sat down on the stone steps and stared at the blue hydrangeas beginning to recover beneath the fresh water I had given them that morning. And for the first time I accepted the cruelest truth of all. Love and destruction can exist inside the same person at the exact same time. My son truly did love me once. I believe that. But illness, fear, and greed twisted that love into something poisonous, something deadly. My story is a warning for anyone listening, because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are also the ones quietly controlling and destroying you. Please never ignore the small warnings your instincts try to show you. Sometimes a lie told to the world becomes the most honest truth you ever tell yourself. Instinct can become the final lifeline when darkness closes in around you. So pay attention to the moment your heart tells you something is wrong. Listen to it. Follow it, because it might save your life the same way it saved mine. If this story gave you something meaningful to think about, please share it with the people you love, and leave a comment below telling me your thoughts. Thank you for walking beside me through this journey of reclaiming my life here on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Do not forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments, so you never miss the next hard lesson life may bring. I'll see you in the next video. I stood up slowly and brushed the dirt from my hands. That morning I made my own coffee. I took my own medication. And for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt dizzy. The early morning sunlight spread across the yard, warming a soul that had finally survived the storm.